How many of you know about an important trial that recently wrapped up in Sweden, in which the man in the dock received a life sentence from the judges? Do you know who this person is? Do you know what he did that justified such a heavy sentence? And why his sentences has enormous international ramifications that could bring about the fall of the regime that he represented? If you don't know about it, this is the fault of your national media, which seems to have overlooked what should have been one of the biggest stories of the year. It's also the fault of investigative journalists who have been asleep at the wheel. And it's the fault of your government and your politicians for not raising the issues that this Swedish trial brought up. Let me tell you that the man who was found guilty and sentenced to life in prison is Hamid Nouri, an Iranian who arrogantly made the mistake of his life by visiting sleepy Sweden and found himself arrested by the Swedish authorities as a result of evidence provided by human rights activists and lawyers. Hamid Nouri was found guilty in playing a leading role in the 1988 death commission, in which the Iranian regime arrested, tortured, and murdered thousands of Iranians who opposed the imposition of the regime of the Ayatollahs. And to this day, their graves in the main are unknown, but there were witnesses, some of whom came forward for Nouri's trial. And as a result of the evidence given, his guilt implicates the current leaders of Iran, including its president, Ibrahim Raisi, who was the chief executioner of the 1988 Death Commission. Now, we recently heard about the visits of President Biden with the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, and alarms were raised because he was accused of ordering the gruesome murder of a Washington Post journalist. It was terrible, I agree. They called him and his country a pariah. But the media had nothing to say about Iran with their appalling human rights record. In fact, they have encouraged the Biden administration to negotiate with the Iranian regime, to appease the Iranian regime, whose president is guilty of the gruesome murder of up to 30,000 of his own citizens. No pariah there, I guess. Sheer hypocrisy. I hope this intro has you sitting up and taking notice. To guide us through the importance and implications of the Nouri trial, I've invited Kaveh Moussavi to give us details from the personal and the legal perspective. Kaveh, welcome to The View from Israel. Welcome to the show.
Good morning, Barry. Thank you very much for inviting me. Yes, I think that was a very good summary of, and sadly, I'd say it's a very good summary because it's a sad reflection of the state of the rule of law in global politics, and in particular with relation to the current regime in Iran. I'm at your disposal.
Let me introduce you. You are an international arbitrator at the International Court of Arbitration, and you're also a human rights lawyer based in Oxford in England. So look, tell us about the background and the history of Hamid Nouri.
Hamid Nouri was a junior prosecutor at Gohardash prison in Iran at the material times, that is to say in the summer of 1988, where the late and certainly unlamented Ayatollah Khomeini issued what is called the death fatwa. He issued a decree that all those prisoners who were continuing to support the Mujahideen Khalq organization, an opposition armed group which had been exiled to Iraq, who had, according to their view, attacked Iran immediately after Iran accepted the UN Security Council resolution on the ceasefire, which had been sitting there on the table for the last 8 years. Iran was finally forced to accept it, and when it did, the Mujahideen sought the advantage provided by the situation to attack in the hope of overthrowing the regime. These were prisoners in prison who had been there for years. Some kids who'd been arrested when they were 12 years old distributing opposition newspapers. Overwhelmingly, they had served their sentences, but they still had not been released. Khomeini issued a flat decree that they should be interviewed, and if any of them were still opposed to the regime, they should be murdered. And this is precisely what happened between the material dates that Hamid Nouri was prosecuted for. The prisons went into a lockdown, televisions were removed, radio was cut off, family visits were stopped, telephones were cut off, and then the death committee, including the current president of Iran, Mr. Raisi, arrived to interview the prisoners one by one. This process lasted approximately 2.5 months, during which the estimates vary. Some estimates say about 30,000. I think the correct figure is approximately 5,000 people were murdered in that period. Murdered, I say, because there wasn't even a formality of a trial. Not even a formality of a trial. 3 questions would usually seal your fate. Indeed, often the first question, are you still a supporter of the MKO? If the answer was, if you responded by saying the organization or the MKO, as opposed to the preferred expression of the regime, which was the terrorist organization, the hypocrites, that was it, that sealed your fate. Something like 5,000 people went to the gallows in that 2 month of summer of 1988 as a result of that fatwa. Hamid Nouri was one of the individuals who were operating in the prison, in Gohardash prison. Of course, these murders were carried out across the country, not just in Gohardash. It happened to be that on the morning of the 16th of October, 2019, I received a telephone call from a former prisoner who had just been alerted to the fact that this man was arriving in Sweden yet again, probably for the 4th time. This was a simple family dispute between a former son-in-law, former stepson-in-law, correction, and his ex-wife, who happened to be the stepdaughter of Hamid Nouri. In desperation, the stepson-in-law was very worried that Hamid Nouri, given his influence in Iran, was about to come and arrange for the de facto kidnap of his child, whose primary custody or custodian was the mother. He searched around and sought various remedies, and on the internet he found that this particular dissident had written about Hamid Nouri, contacted him by email, and they met on the morning of the 16th of October. I was having breakfast that morning, and my telephone rang. I picked it up. The dissident with whom I had some acquaintance told me that Nouri was coming. What did I need to arrest him? I said, I had no idea who Nouri was. Barry, you see, there was so many of these murderers that it's understandable if one forgets the names of the odd killer. And he was a fairly junior cog in the wheel, so it doesn't strike one as the top of the list of this regime of serial murderers. When it was explained to me who he was and what his role was, I said, I need 3 witnesses, and that would be quite enough. On the 19th of October, the dissident arrived in London and took me to the home of one other person at whose residence another former prisoner was, and we took witness statements from them. And I told them on that very morning that this is quite enough for me to arrest this man. I contacted immediately the prosecution service in Sweden, and in particular the War Crimes Unit, and we had a conversation and proceeded to file representations by taking a few more witness statements from other people who were introduced to me. The net result was that on the afternoon of the 9th of November, that is 20 days after I'd begun to take witness statements, he arrived at Arlanda Airport in Stockholm, and he was detained, interrogated by the prosecutor's representatives, and under caution was arrested. Papers were filed with the district court. He was in judicial quarantine for 4 days, appeared before the investigating magistrate, district judge, on the 13th of November, at which point he was ordered to be kept in remand for 28 days, with the prosecution ordered to bring him to the court in 28 days or release him. And if they didn't want to release him, they should show cause as to why he should be kept in custody. A month later, he was brought back to court, and I was there. And the district court renewed the detention order because the evidence was being accumulated. Literally hundreds of people by now had heard about this, because the television stations, various news channels had announced it. And the very fact that literally hundreds of people came forward, including people in Iran, families whose children had been murdered back in 1988, they came forward, and we were overwhelmed. But the prosecution service put a budget together, they put a team of investigators together, and it took approximately 21 months to prepare the case. Now, the judge had ordered them to bring him to court because clearly the presumption of innocence must prevail where there's a rule of law, and the judge was not prepared to permit this to continue. So his trial began on the 10th of August, and the verdict was announced almost a year later on the 14th of July. It was a very compelling case. He had the best of defense counsel, and they did their very best, and I congratulate them, as one must. I am reminded of the Eichmann trial in Jerusalem back in 1961 too, who Eichmann was granted the defense of choice, and so that there could be no question at the end of the day that this was a fair and just verdict when it was arrived, because the evidence was examined in this case. There were 60-something witnesses who came forward, and the case was overwhelming, and the court really had very little alternative but to inflict the maximum punishment which the law permits in Sweden, which is life imprisonment. He has until a few days' time to appeal. I think he will appeal on various technicalities. I have no doubt that he'll be permitted to appeal, and I have no doubt the appeal will not succeed. And I have no doubt that the sentence will be confirmed. What I am a little concerned about, given what has happened this morning in Belgium, and I hope you don't mind my talking about this, Belgium has just ratified legislation. To its lasting shame, Belgium is going to, this is the Iranian King Leopold II moment in terms of Belgium's shame in international politics. Belgium has ratified legislation that permits it to return prisoners to Iran to serve their sentence in Iran. Amongst those prisoners is Asadullah Assadi, a terrorist who planned to bomb the MKO conference in Paris in July of 2018, at which there were about 600 people present. He was about to murder about 600 people. He was arrested in Germany because his co-conspirators were arrested in Belgium. He was extradited to Belgium. He was sentenced to 20 years. And it is breathtaking hypocrisy to watch the government of Belgium bring legislation before the parliament, which was approved last night, just before parliament goes into recess, which technically permits the government of Belgium to return this convicted terrorist to Iran. The legislation says that he has to serve his time in Iran, but you can imagine a terrorist who's been sent by the government of Iran is not exactly going to be serving a hard time. To add insult to injury, Mr. Shaw, I will put on the record here in your program, the legislation permits the government of Iran to issue an amnesty or reduce the sentence according to not Belgian law, but according to Iranian law. Need I say any more about the dangerous state that the world is in and how far we have come in forgetting the lessons of the 1930s, what happened in Europe? If we give in to terrorism like this, the future is truly, truly worrying.
I want to talk to you a bit later in the show about some of the other international crimes, the mass murders committed by the Iranian regime. But for now, just tell me, how was Nouri ranked in the hierarchy of the death committee? And describe, if you can, some of the evidence that convinced the judges of his guilt.
Nouri was as I said earlier, a cog in the wheel. He was a deputy prosecutor at the Gohardash prison, but these rankings mean nothing. I mean, when in a conventional judicial system, when you talk about a prosecutor and you're asked to talk about a deputy prosecutor, you ask, what does that mean? There's a description, there's a textbook will tell you what they are. These are just, this is a machinery of murder, frankly. They needed no legal qualification whatsoever. Raisi himself he doesn't have a degree. He doesn't even have a high school diploma. And he's now the president of Iran. He was one of the 4 members of the death committee at the time. He had 6 grades, or as further investigations showed, he had 5 grades of primary school. And he was given the power of life and death over the lives of young Iranians who were at the time opposed to the rule of this obscurantist, dark-hearted clergy. So you can imagine if his boss's boss had a 5th grade certificate in primary school, you can imagine the description of him as a deputy prosecutor is, to put it as mild, as an extremely generous one. He was a jack of many trades in prison, and certainly the master of none. But he was an experienced murderer. His task was mainly to select the prisoners who were going to go before the death committee. And you can imagine how capricious, how arbitrary that would be. And his task was to lead them blindfolded to the amphitheater where the gallows were there. And often it was the case that the victims had no idea they were about to be murdered until the rope was put around their necks. Because the court, in inverted commas, would say, this one to the left, the other one to the right. Those who were sent to the left, it meant send them to the amphitheater and hang them. And frequently, within 15 minutes of the verdict, in inverted commas, these young men were hanged. Nouri's role was to select the prisoners and herd them before the death committee, and then guide them to the gallows. And then he was often seen, many prisoners saw him carrying watches of the victims who'd just been murdered. This is not the mindset of what you and I would understand as a prosecutor, as a legally trained man and officer of the law, there to protect the notion of the rule of law. He was a cog in the machinery of mass murder, who was willing to be a cog in the wheel. Often they were asked to join in the hanging.
Why would a criminal with such a gruesome history venture to Europe and Sweden? Doesn't that to you show a degree of arrogance, immunity from punishment, and perhaps a strong measure of impunity, knowing that his regime will threaten any country that lays a finger on him? After all, Iran arrested a Swedish-Iranian doctor and placed a death sentence on him, in my opinion, as a warning or a threat to the Swedish court. Is this the way that the Iranians play the game? They feel themselves above universal jurisdiction?
I think you hit the nail on the head, Barry, when you mentioned the word impunity. Impunity is the name of the game. They've got away with it so many times. So many Western governments have simply caved in and given in to the threats of terrorism and hostage-taking. Look, there are a number of international conventions and treaties on the suppression of terrorism and hostage-taking, but clearly the latest example is Belgium. Belgium has ratified 12 international treaties which are there to fight terrorism, hostage taking, and behavior like the Iranian regimes. And yet, only last night, it passed legislation which permits it to return a convicted terrorist to Iran. In the past, it's been the case that murderers who were caught on the spot, for example, in the summer of 1989 in Vienna, the leader of the Kurdish Democratic Party, the late Dr. Qasemlu, was assassinated by two Iranian terrorists, Mr. Ghafour Darjazi and Mr. Sahraroudi. And in fact, the bullet ricocheted and hit Mr. Sahraroudi. He was actually in hospital when he was arrested. And the Austrian government simply handed them back to Iran. And one of them became the chef de bureau, head of the personal office of Mr. Laijani, who became the head of the Iranian national TV and broadcasting station, and then became the speaker of the Iranian parliament. And then he was a presidential candidate. This murderer was the head of his office, and the other murderer became the head of security at the Iranian national broadcasting station. That's the kind of cave-in that they did. In the case of the murderers of the late, and to me, certainly the sorely lamented Dr. Shapur Bakhtiar, the last prime minister of His late Imperial Majesty the Shah, you know what happened. I mean, he was arrested. He was convicted by the High Criminal Court in Paris to life imprisonment. Of course, in his case, he did do actually 18 years, but then he was exchanged for a French student national who'd been taken hostage in Iran in the immediate aftermath of the Tehran Spring, which happened a couple of years before the so-called Arab Spring. In other cases, we have had terrorists returned immediately. So we were hoping that now with the International Criminal Court and the fact that Belgium has ratified the International Criminal Court Treaty and the Charter, in the case of Sweden, I think they are going to be more resilient. I think they're going to not cave into this kind of thing. And the Swedish-Iranian doctor is not the only one. There are two other young men who we know, just two Swedish tourists who were in Iran. They had some hard drugs planted on them. And as you know, drug dealing in Iran is a capital offense. So they have been hauled before Iran's most notorious hanging judge. And so the potential death sentence is hanging over 3 Swedish nationals. And Iran is made no bones about the fact that it intends to hang them unless Sweden hands over Hamid Nouri. Yeah, we live in truly terrible times in that all that we have fought for the rule of law is being undermined by a terrorist regime that is now threatening to wreak mass murder on the entire region and, of course, Israel. By it's quite open about it. Its nuclear program is going ahead, and these are worrying times. If we do not call a halt now, things are going to get from bad to worse, I'm afraid. Yes.
Let's identify the current leaders of Iran who are implicated in the 1988 Death Commission and yet have gone on to achieve even higher offices in Iran. Talk to me, if you can, about the 2016 investigation that examined the 1988 massacre, the Death Commission, that implicated the current government officials, including the Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei, the current Iranian President Ebrahim Raisi, and the current Supreme Court Justice Chief Gholam Hussein Mohseni. Talk to me about that.
Mr. Khamenei, at the time of the prison massacres, was the president of Iran. He clearly had a personal, direct responsibility, and that chain of command goes right up to him. He's now the supreme leader of Iran. He's the Führer of Iran. Raisi was a member of the Death Committee who is personally responsible for having issued hundreds, if not thousands, of death sentences. Criminal murder orders, not death sentences, because the death sentence suggests that there was something remotely resembling a recognized conventional judicial process. There was nothing of the sort. Let's be absolutely clear on that. There was nothing of the sort. This was a machinery of murder cranked up into high gear, a meat processor which murdered approximately 5,000 young Iranians over those 2 months. Raisi is now the president of Iran. Mr. Nayeri, who was the prosecutor general of Iran, he sits on the Supreme Court, was one of the death committees. Mr. Pur Mohammadi, who was the Minister of Justice. I mean, talk about insult to the language. Minister of Justice. Talk about insult to intelligence. Talk about the insult to the honor and the dignity of the Iranian people. That this man was the Minister of Justice of Iran under Mr. Ahmadinejad. There are many, many others. I am not surprised that now they don't dare to travel outside Iran. I have hard and verified information coming to me from Iran that the regime has frozen in its boots with this verdict. They overwhelmingly did not believe that this verdict would come. They thought they would be able to spring Nouri, just like they've sprung many, many other terrorists and murderers in the past. And they thought they'd be able to negotiate some kind of a deal. And frankly, in a week in which Belgium has so cravenly and cowardly, in such a cowardly manner, caved in to regime intimidation and blackmail, I'm not surprised that a lot of them felt that they could probably pull this one off. But I'm pretty confident that Sweden is made of more resilient stuff and that it will withstand these pressures, and that given its commitment to the International Criminal Court and its ratification of the Rome Charter, if the worst comes to worst, it just has to hand over such cases to the International Criminal Court, because Iran has not, but Sweden definitely has ratified the ICC statute. So while I am confident that Nouri will not be released and will do his time, I am on a day where we should be joyful for this strike in favor of international criminal law and international human rights law. We have the spectacle of a member of NATO, indeed the country in which NATO is based, its headquarters is based, the country in which the European Parliament sits, a country which has ratified the European Union Charter of Rights, a country which has ratified, of course, the European Convention on Human Rights, a country which has ratified the Warsaw Convention on Terrorism, a country which has ratified the 1979 hostage-taking convention, and at least 8 other conventions, has just caved in to this. It's basically engaged in this cowardly surrender, which sends a terrible signal for all those people across the world who are desperately trying to make sure that we move away from this lawless jungle, which Putin is trying to bring about in the world and trying to establish some sort of norms. The last time we had the breakdown of the international order, we witnessed the murder of 60 million civilians, 6 million Jews, hundreds of thousands of other Slavs and Gypsies and others, as it were. We thought we'd learned that lesson. I confess I have never felt more pessimistic about the state of the world. So I can just see what it felt like in 1937 and 1938 in Europe, frankly.
Kaveh, as you know, I'm speaking to you from Israel, and I never like making any comparison of the Holocaust with any other major crimes because of the scale of things. However, I do notice a couple of comparisons in a certain way. If Nouri, who was now been sentenced to life in prison for the crimes, if Nouri could be looked at as the Eichmann, then Ibrahim Raisi could be looked at as the Hitler. You mentioned the Führer, and he's still in power. It set me thinking, what would happen if Eichmann had been arrested in South America, brought over to Israel for trial, while Hitler was still in power in Germany? Now, this might sound to be exaggerated, but later in our conversation, I will be raising another issue which compounds what I say, but I'll leave that to later. What I want to say to you, or ask you, is that in 2018, The United Nations stated that the 1988 massacre was, in their words, a crime against humanity. And a prominent international jurist, Jeffrey Robertson, QC, described the 1988 massacres as the worst crime against humanity since the Second World War. Now, you work with Jeffrey Robertson. What are the chances of advancing the conclusions of the judges in the trial of Nouri to implicate people like Ibrahim Raisi? How can a structure be built to successfully investigate Raisi's crimes? And what route needs to be taken to bring the evidence to the ICC with a demand for his arrest to stand trial at the International Criminal Court?
Yeah, let me just, in parenthesis, Barry, say that the author of the Genocide Convention, the Polish Jewish lawyer Raphael Lemkin, was adamant that genocide does not require hundreds of thousands to be murdered. What it does require is a selection for murder on the grounds of race, religion, or such matters. So you can murder one person, and that could be a genocidal murder, as opposed to an ordinary murder. So while I take your point about the scale of the Nazi Holocaust, the precedent of that is the fact that it became defined as genocide by the UN was because of the efforts, the single-handed efforts of Raphael Lemkin. And he was quite clear that, whether it is 6 million or 6, if you select someone because he's a Jew, or if you select someone because he's Armenian, or if you select someone because he's a Tutsi, or if you select someone because he's a Kurd, and murder them for that reason, that constitutes genocide. Having said that, I think I tried very hard to persuade the prosecutor to take genocide, and well, I can see why she didn't, but okay, you win one, you lose one, but at least you go forward, which is what we did. Regarding direct response to your question, yes, indeed, I worked with Jeffrey Robertson and on the seminal report, which was commissioned by the Abdurrahman Burumand Foundation, a human rights charity, by the two Burumand sisters whose father was murdered, assassinated in Paris a few weeks before Dr. Bakhtiar himself was assassinated. Dr. Burumand was a very close associate of Dr. Bakhtiar, and he was murdered, and it is in his honor that the Burumand Foundation was founded, and they commissioned a report by Jeffrey Robertson, which left no doubt that this was a crime against humanity. First of all, factually, it was correct, and it had happened. Secondly, that it was a crime against humanity, and it merited prosecution. That report was the basis of the Russell Tribunal, kind of Iran tribunal, which was a people's tribunal, which had obviously no executive power, but it constitutes a huge source of evidence for us when we were preparing the representations and the criminal complaint to the Swedish prosecution service. What needs to be done at the moment, of course, Iran is not a member of the International Criminal Court, and Raisi cannot be arraigned by the ICC except by two mechanisms. One is by a resolution of the Security Council and referral from the UN Security Council, which unfortunately, given the presence of Putin's Russia on that council, it seems highly improbable, because if Putin gives in to the idea of endorsing such a resolution, well, then he'll be next himself, because the crimes that he is accused of are as egregious, as serious as Raisi has engaged in. So there's not much hope of that. The other hope is, of course, if one of the crimes that the regime has committed, and the regime has committed many, many crimes in many countries. One of them is Amia in Buenos Aires of only 3 days ago, where the Jewish center was blown up. The Israeli-Argentinian Friendship Center was blown up, in which 85 people were murdered and 300 odd people were seriously injured. If I'm exploring this, if Argentina were to make an application to the International Criminal Court, now there are issues of jurisdiction, there are issues of limitations issue, the fact that that murder took place in July of 1994, and the Rome Statute did not become international law until July of 2002. But given that the murder remains unresolved in the sense that the issues continue and the culprits have not been apprehended and punished, one could conceivably argue this is a continuing crime, and therefore it's not statute barred, as it well. I mean, I don't want to get technical about this, but Iran has committed atrocities on the territory of many countries which do belong to the ICC, and I am racking my brains with, along with the junior prosecutor in a country, in a jurisdiction that's highly respected in terms of the credibility of its judicial institutions. It's not a place like Iran. It's not Somalia. It's a serious law-based, rule-based country which has internationally recognized legitimacy in terms of its legal institutions, hoping to issue an arrest warrant against Raisi. There are difficulties, there are obstacles, but that's a challenge. That's what lawyers are paid for, to find a way and push the law forward. The one certainty is, in the middle of all this doom and serious gloom, is that the Iranian regime is collapsing. It has no domestic legitimacy. Its economy is collapsed. Its corruption is pernicious. It is eaten away into all the institutions of the state, so that you cannot even speak of institutions. Its international legitimacy is zero. Its incapacitation to deliver the basics of life to the Iranian population. As you can see, its internal cohesion is completely shattered. The only instruments upon which it is reliant are the security apparatus. And you can imagine how inefficient they are because, well, to take one example, the Israeli intelligence services have been able to operate almost with impunity inside Iran. The assassination of the Dr. Fakhrizadeh, who was the mastermind of Iran's genocidal nuclear program, the assassination of the IRGC colonel literally outside his door a few weeks ago, shows that the security services are really not up to the task. And the reason for that is corruption. The reason for that is that they have lost all belief in their own capacity. And so the good news is that we are going to get these people. Now, the intention is under the prevailing international criminal law, the men, and it is overwhelmingly men. There are a few women too, who have been responsible for these egregious violations of human rights over the last 44 years in Iran, that they'll be given every opportunity to conduct a defense, so that the verdict must be a credible one, and we are after justice and not revenge. I think that the moment is pretty close, and whether it comes or not in the next year or two, I know not. But what I do know is the is unquestionable, undoubted march and progress of the law will take its course, and these men will be answerable sooner rather than later.
People forget that Iran has a pattern of conducting the most barbaric attacks internationally and literally getting away with murder. You mentioned just a few days ago, we had the anniversary of the bombing, like you reminded us, of the Jewish center in Buenos Aires, which killed 85 people, mostly Jews. This harks back to what I mentioned earlier, of another sort of comparison of comparing people like Ibrahim Raisi with the Führer of Germany, etc. And the chutzpah of the Iranians is that Moussavi, who was one of the suspects of that bombing, had the, as I said, the chutzpah to visit South America in January of this year to attend the investiture ceremony of the Nicaraguan president, Daniel Ortega. And this Moussavi Raisi is today, his current capacity is the Iranian vice president for economic affairs. It's another example of the arrogant immunity and impunity that the Iranians feel today as they continue alive and killing. And let's not forget also, this should involve the American administration, the Beirut bombing massacres that killed 241 US servicemen and women at that time in 1983. And again, some of the perpetrators are alive and killing in the current regime today in Iran.
It's interesting you mentioned Mr. Rezai's visit to Managua, Nicaragua. I tracked his flight, Barry, and it's very interesting that they clearly are very frightened of flying over countries because, well, Rezai was an IRGC officer at the time of the Buenos Aires bombing. Indeed, he was the head of the IRGC, and its offshoot, the Quds Force, was responsible for that egregious mass murder at the Amia Center in Buenos Aires. Rezai's plane left Iran and overflew, guess what? Iraq, okay, no law there. Syria, no law there. Over the Mediterranean international space, so you couldn't scramble fighters over a national space to bring it down. Over Gibraltar into the open sea, and then refuels in an African country where there's no prosecution service worthy of name, and then flies across the Atlantic directly to Managua, and then it goes to Venezuela. And surreptitiously, without announcing any dates, it returns. What does that tell you, Barry? It tells me that they are, despite all the bravura about we are doing this and we are there and we are the government of God and all the rest of it, they are petrified. They're very frightened. They needed to make a show of pretending that they're safe, they're stable, they're secure in their place. But just look at the flight plan of that aircraft and you'll see that no, they're not. They're extremely, and that was before the Nouri verdict. I've had numerous verified messages from inside the headquarters of IRGC. There's a Farsi expression, the guy is so frightened, if you cut him, he will not bleed, that he's frozen. He's effectively frozen with fear. And a message comes to me saying, I can read it to you. It says, boss, let me tell you this. Today, if you cut these people with a knife, you won't see any blood. They are so frightened of the impact of the Nouri verdict. They have no idea who's next. They thought they're going to be able to see this off, and they clearly haven't. So that's the message that the Nouri verdict sends to these people. You may run, but you're not going to hide. We're going to get you eventually.
You have personal connections with Jeffrey Robertson, QC. What I would suggest, if Mr. Robertson can be put in contact with Erwin Kotler, who was a former Minister of Justice in Canada and an international jurist for crimes against humanity, with experience at the International Criminal Court, highly respected and experienced. I think that combination could move the ball forward. There's a wave of international support on this. A year ago, in May last year, 152 former United Nations officials, Nobel laureates, former heads of state and human rights experts called for an international investigation into the 1988 crimes of the Iranian regime. And a month later, on my birthday, 2021, 19th of June, Amnesty International issued a statement that started off like this, and I quote, that Ebrahim Raisi has risen to the presidency instead of being investigated for the crimes against humanity for murder, enforced disappearance, and torture is a grim reminder that impunity reigns supreme in Iran. How do we put a stop to this, and how can we get the ball going that would lead to the investigation with the evidence that will implicate President Raisi of Iran?
Barry, we live in terrible times, I'm afraid. I thought that the lessons of the Second World War had been learned, and if we move towards a lawless world, we are going to have a repetition. In the words of George Santayana, those who do not learn from history shall relive it. I'm afraid the presupposition of the law being a remedy is that there's a state of law in the world, or at least in enough of the world for one to be able to rely upon. We live in an era where Putin has so egregiously violated the most fundamental tenets of international law in Ukraine, and but for Western resolve, which I fear, given the behavior of Belgium today, I'm not sure how much we can count on. But for that, I think the entirety of the international legal structure, international rules-based order is seriously under threat. Unless we can reverse this, I'm afraid the future looks pretty grim. I am beginning to wonder whether I should be thinking of a different profession, because I'm just wondering, in a world in which the Putins of this world get away, and the only way to stop them isn't through the law, is through armed force, which seems to be pretty effective. Make no mistake about it, if Putin is not defeated, everything that we have discussed today is going to be no more than of academic relevance for future historians. Make no mistake about it, there is no natural order of things which insists that the world should be a rule-based order. For a rule-based world order, we need to fight, we need to campaign, we need to demonstrate, we need to petition, we need to organize, we need to do this intelligently. We are at the edge of a precipice, which, if we were having this discussion in the mid-1990s, where Francis Fukuyama was writing a book about the end of history and the triumph of the liberal order, I would have been much more optimistic in this discussion with you. I wish I could be more optimistic, but of course I have to be optimistic because we have no choice. We have to be, because otherwise we may as well return to the caves. Look, we live in an international order in which Belgium, a member of NATO, which is fighting in Ukraine, not in Ukraine, but supporting Ukrainian resistance against fascism on the march again, they cave in to Iran. They just hand it over. I live in a country in which the Prime Minister is openly talking about breaking international law with the Northern Ireland Protocol. We live in truly dangerous times. Those who do not learn from history are condemned to relive it. These are times in which we have to be alert, and I'm very grateful to you for this opportunity to put this on the record, that Belgium has just committed a crime against humanity by caving into this, in this cowardly fashion, to those murderers operating out of Tehran. We got to put an end to this. I appeal through your camera to the government of Israel and to all the free-thinking people who do understand the grim menace that we are facing right now, a grim menace called the Islamic Republic of Iran, to do their best to reverse what has happened in Belgium yesterday. To bring in legislation that gives in to Iranian regime terrorists, which forces the Belgian government to release a convicted terrorist, Asadullah Assadi, who was about to plant a bomb in the middle of Paris, is indeed a very grim tale indeed, which we've got to try and stop.
I can assure you, Kaveh, that Israel is hot-wired with regard to Iran. In fact, I'll go so far as to say that Israel is the country that's at the forefront of challenging Iran when it comes to their nuclear ambition. But let me end our conversation by asking you this question. I think it's an important one. How many witnesses gave evidence to the judges in the Nori trial? And in your estimate, how many witnesses will come forward to give evidence to the ICC in a trial against Raisi?
The problem of the prosecutor is going to be too many witnesses and not too few. That you have my assurance on. The experience of organizing the complaint against Nouri before the tribunal in Stockholm told me that we have more than enough evidence to be able to convict him. The obstacles are of a different nature, the ones that I discussed earlier.
Kaveh Moussavi, I appreciate you giving us your time and your information. I hope we can keep an open microphone here for things as things progress, and I can have you back again on The View from Israel to hear your views or whatever progress has been made. Thank you for your time.
It's been a pleasure, Barry. Thank you very much. And let's keep up the good work, because times are truly dangerous right now. Thank you.
To you, the viewers, when will the world say never again and mean it? When will the civilized world that talks constantly about crimes against humanity, human rights, begin to stand up and make Iran an example? Let's hope they do it before the Ayatollahs and the leaders of Iran possess the ultimate doomsday weapon, because Iran is emboldened by the weakness of the West, a West that refuses to bring them to justice. Where is the United Nations Human Rights Council? Where is the International Criminal Court? Where is Human Rights Watch? Where is Amnesty International? It's time for them to act, and act now. This is Barry Shaw, and this has been The View from Israel.
אנו מכריזים בזאת